Hi guys, bit of a lighter video this week, just going to be going through some basing tips, and to start with, how to make some tiny leaves. So to start with, you will need a leaf hole punch. This one's from AK Interactive. Other brands are available. And then we will need something to hole punch. So, with some water, and we're going to mix in some AK Interactive paints. These are quite heavily pigmented, so it's really good for this. And go ahead and add a few drops into water in a suitable container. So I'm going with an orange colour and more of a brown colour, just to get some nice autumnal leaves. And you can mix them or not, depending on what you want the end effect to look like. And you want to be quite shallow with the water here, because we want it to evaporate overnight. And once those are mixed together, we're going to take some paper and cut it into small rectangles and dunk it in. I'm just using regular A4 paper. Probably get some nicer effects using some nicer paper, but this is what I had on hand. I imagine you could get some really good effects using crepe paper. And it doesn't matter if some bits aren't as well covered as others, because that will just give some variation to the colour tone, and that's what we want to do by using this technique. And just give the paper a nice bath. Then leave it out overnight so it will evaporate. Now this looks really dry and crispy, but it is still very flexible, still got the consistency of paper. And we're just going to take the leaf punch and start clipping out leaves. And it doesn't matter if one side of the paper is still more white, because one side of the leaf will be facing down on the base, so you will almost never see it. And by letting it naturally evaporate, you get some really nice kind of almost ink effects on the paper that mimics the natural variance that you get in leaf colour. As you can see, you get loads of leaves out of one tiny piece of paper, and it doesn't matter if you're going over areas you've already hole punched, that just makes broken leaves, adds even more variance, mixing the yellow in with the brown ones now, and this is going to give us some nice leaf scatter for an autumn scene. It's also worth remembering, when leaves have fallen off a tree, they are normally brown. So you could make green leaves, but it would be a little bit fantastical. But maybe that's what you want to go for. Now, to make the leaves look a little bit more realistic, we're just going to pick them up and roll them around, crimp the edges slightly, give them a bit of 3D-ness, because you don't want them to be completely flat. And then it's ready just to go on the base. Using a volunteer guinea pig here. And if you use a double-sided container, then you can also use it to store the excess paper and leaves for next time. Now, next up, I got this herb grinder online. Has many uses, but it's very useful for breaking down basing materials. So I've got these large cork chunks, and I'm just going to break them down into smaller pieces. And you could use something like a bullet mixer or a blender for this, but I find it's a bit overkill when a few twists of this will do the same job. A lot less noisy. And it's also about half the cost. So there we've broken that down into smaller pieces, and if we grind even more, then we get even smaller pieces. It's great for making small rocks or just mixing in with your basing paste, adding a bit of variation there. And it also works on the clump foliage I use. So we can see here it's one big piece, and to break it down into almost kind of a flock, we're just going to give it a few grinds, and it will just absolutely pull apart with your fingers. And this is great for putting on walls, making kind of like an ivy or an overgrown moss, where the larger clumps aren't as helpful. and then you can just store them in a spare bag, as some I made earlier. And then when you need them, you can just pull them out of the bag onto the base. Now, as luck would have it, I had another leaf hole punch. So I'm just going to show the difference between the two. This one's from Green Stuff World, I believe. Now, the one I have from AK is specifically maple leaves, but the Green Stuff World one on the right is regular mixed leaves. So, just going to punch them out and have a look. Now this one has a tighter kind of spread to it, which is a little bit easier for maximising the paper. Now, I'm no leaf expert, but I believe this is a leaf. And to make them look a little bit more realistic, you just give them a little bit of a squeeze with your fingers. And if you have them held by tweezers in the middle, then you get that nice kind of natural bend to them. Next up, we have the basing paste. So I've got two of these from Vallejo, and it's basically just a chunky paste that you put it on the base, and it adds texture. Now these basing pastes are all fairly similar, you just smear them on, and it makes it look like dirt. And you usually want to paint over the top of them, but they look okay without painting as well. And I'm just going to knock up a few examples on some spare bases I have. So this first one will just be the plain earth basing paste. Mixed up one with the grey pumice, and then making a final one, which I'm going to add some rocks and debris to, which is how I normally use them. Because the main advantage of using these is you can put them down as a base layer, and while they're still wet, you can drop gravel and rocks on them. So for the first pass, going to use this kind of tiny gravel, and then some larger rocks. And these ones I got from a garden centre for terrariums, and they were a lot cheaper than if you buy them from a hobby store. And just taking 3 or 4 of them and poking them down into the paste. Now when you use the tinier gravel, you really want to go along and with the flat end of a knife or a sculpting tool, just push them down a bit. Because otherwise you can get some weird ones where they stand on end and look very unnatural. And the final thing I use for my basing is these tiny tufts. And you can use regular sized tufts, it will mostly depend on the size of the model and the base. But I find the tiny ones look a lot better for 28mm. So now just going to knock up a base and show how I do it. So going in first with the Vallejo grey pumice texture paste, and giving a nice smear of that all over the base. And giving it a sprinkle with the tiny gravel. Patting the stones down with the sculpting tool. Then putting 2 or 3 choice rocks on the base. Then jumping back to our test bases, because they have now dried. So once they dry, very kind of tough, and you can remove them if you really give them a good scrape, but for most wear and tear, they're completely fine. So the regular paste has a kind of finer grip to it, and the grey pumice, very interestingly, although you put it on white, it dries transparent. So it could be good for some snow effects if you don't want to paint it. And then we have the mixed medium base, which doesn't look as good without being painted. and that was the grey pumice I used on the base for the Mini. So we're going to go ahead and prime everything using Vallejo Black Primer. So it's useful to do the basing paste and the rocks before you prime the model, so you can do it all as one, not have to go back and do another bit later. And when you paint the bases, you don't want to use your best brush, you want to use one that's a little bit knackered because the roughness on the bases will destroy the brush. So when our bases have dried, we're going to take a dark brown and give them all a good coating. Now I reckon by using both the types of basing paste on different areas of the base, you can make some really cool effects, so that's probably something I will explore in the future. But for now, just give everything a nice dark brown coat. Now this one was the grey pumice, and we can see it's got a larger grit to it, so that's really going to stand out with a dry brush, and you can really see here where the recesses are still black and the paint's not going into them. And then doing the same process for the Mini, but also hitting the rim of the base. Now it doesn't have to be completely dry for this step, but we're just going to take a light grey and hit the top sides of the rocks. And then with a lighter brown, almost a sand colour, we're just going to go ahead and dry brush over the entire thing. And it doesn't matter if you go over the rocks as well, because it's going to tie everything together and make that kind of dusty topsoil. And here we just have the plain earth texture ground paste. And you can see it still looks fine. It's still perfectly serviceable. Doesn't need the rocks or anything in. And then with the grey pumice, just hitting the absolute top sides of the grit. And it looks a lot more gravelly than the others. And we do the same process on the Mini's base, except we are then going to add some tiny tufts. I find that 2 tufts is normally a good amount, but it will depend on the size and the kind of environment you want to go for. And we're then going to dab a tiny bit of PVA on, grab one of the leaves we made earlier, and attach it on the edge. And once that's done, we're going to jump cut to the finished Mini. And as you can see, very easy, quick, and serviceable base. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the tips. I'll be back next week.